कभी करती हैं मुलाकातें, कभी करती हैं मुलाकातें, कभी यादों में बरसातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें। मन की गहरी झील में कूद जाती हैं कभी, सोच के दरिया के संग संग बहती जाती हैं कभी। चाहे शाम हो या हो रातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें।
Hello and welcome to Kitabnama, Books and Beyond. We have with us today Sara Rai. She's a writer and a translator. She's equally comfortable with Hindi, Urdu and English, 3 languages. She has 2 collections of short stories. She has co-edited a book on regional fiction. She has also authored a novel. She has translated 2 novellas for children and has several published articles, reviews and stories to her credit. Ms. Rai, we'd like to ask you, you belong to a tradition of historical authors like Premchand, who have contributed who have changed and shaped the novel in Hindi per se and short stories in Hindi. He's called the Dickens of India. Amrit Rai, great publisher, critic. Alok Rai, who's written Hindi Nationalism, which is in itself a seminal work on Hindi in India. How do you see yourself? Where do you see yourself in this chain of tradition?
Yes, they have been very important in the shaping of Hindi today. And Alok, of course, has been a commentator, and he has, chalked out the whole politics of language right from the beginnings. People ask me why I started writing. So I grew up surrounded by books, and with all these figures in the house, there was no one who was not reading, and more or less everyone in my family in the earlier generation was writing. Right. Including my mother and my grandmother, my aunts on both sides, and more or less everyone I saw was writing something or the other. So it kind of happened that I also found myself reading first, and then that reading automatically got translated into writing at a very early stage in my life. Right. And I think the first thing I ever wrote was at the age of 9, which was published by now famous Arvind Krishnan Mehrotra. Right. They used to bring out he was in university then. So Alok, my cousin, and Arvind, they were bringing out this journal called Damn You. Right. And so my story, Lucky Horace, was in English first.
You were 9.
I was 9 years old.
Yeah.
So that was published. That was my first ever published work, if I may call it that. Yeah. And obviously, it was heavily influenced by all the writers that I was reading at that point, mainly Enid Blyton playing a very big role in it. Right. So, that was the inception of my starting to write. Yeah. But this whole thing came about because there were so many people in the family writing. So maybe I just felt that I had to emulate some kind of, role model or whatever, everyone was writing, so that was the thing to be done, and I just fell naturally into that kind of role. And then gradually, I wrote that, and then there was a long period in which, everyone experiments with writing poetry at some point or the other. So in school, one wrote all those silly lines. I call them silly now because, it was just your one's playing with language, trying to grapple with things, and this, I think, translating also happened because of that. It was just a sort of playing with language.
So primarily, your first writing as a 9-year-old was in English.
That was in English.
In English, and and Hindi. You never thought that since you're a part of this tradition, you need to champion the cause of Hindi and.
No, actually, it was like that. Because we were sent to an English medium school. I studied in a convent school. Right. And everything was taught in English, and so it was a Roman Catholic school. You didn't even get much literature there. Just basically Anglo literature in the library. Starting from good girl manuals and things like that. And there was hardly any Hindi, but at home there was Hindi, and there was a whole lot of other languages being spoken around. There was Bhojpuri. My grandmother used to come from the village. She spoke Bhojpuri. Right. So there was this whole mix going on at the time, in my head. Right. So it all started with that. And then as I grew older, I think just this consciousness of my own position,
where you come from,
where I come from, the ground on which one stands is very important. So that was there.
So your first collection of short stories was in Hindi?
Yes, yes.
Abil Ki Udan.
Yeah, actually I never wrote anything in English after that.
Right.
So I did write, but not published. You know, it was not published. I did write my non-fiction, which was in English, but my fiction is all in Hindustani. It's not even Hindi. I call it Hindustani because it's a eclectic mix of both the languages.
Hindi and Urdu, right.
So
on the language question, in this article that you wrote for DNA a few years back, you talked about Cheel Wali Koti, your novel, and you said that the first 4 chapters you had to write in English, and then after that you started writing in Hindi for the novel. So how do you choose your language?
well, actually the whole thing comes out of this experimentation with form, I think, at that sort of level, and I'm comfortable. I'm equally comfortable in both. But I think the language dictates itself according to the material that one is writing.
Right.
And Cheel Wali Koti, my novel, being set in Banaras and the sights and sounds of that city, and somehow it lent itself much more easily to Hindi.
Hindi, right.
And since it also has little snatches of Bhojpuri, and it has, you know, few words of English also thrown in here and there, because actually the novel is a multi-layered narrative. It's in 3 voices.
Right.
And one is this girl, this orphan girl, who's completely more or less illiterate when in the beginning of the novel, whose voice develops as the novel goes on, from a semi-literate, illiterate, semi-literate, then she aspires to be a writer, so she becomes, you know, it becomes a very literary sort of language as she grows up. Basically it's a triple layered sort of narrative.
Yeah.
It's in 3 voices, the voice of Vikram and the voice of Pranav Narayan Das. These are sort of scions of a very old family from Banaras.
Right.
So they have that whole cultural lineage behind them.
Yeah.
So it's that sort of language. And there's also, for Vikram, who belongs to the new generation, there's this English inflected kind of language that he speaks. So basically it's according to the material that I choose the language.
There was a juxtaposition between the narrative which was focused on the city and the narrative which is focused in Banaras.
Yeah.
So you've talked about empty rooms, high-rise buildings, and the barrenness of the city compared to Banaras, which has a lot of nostalgia and memory and the subsequent alienation that one feels in the city. So why Banaras? What is
Actually the novel, the bit that it starts with, it's set in Delhi.
Right.
The opening of the novel, it's in flashback, and the girl who has lived in Banaras and who's this orphan that I earlier talked about, who grows up in Banaras, but she has moved to Delhi after the whole action of the novel has taken place. So she's looking back on it now.
Right.
And she's remembering her whole life and her desire and her search for identity and the way she's moving forward. So the whole of the action has actually happened already, and it has also colored her voice, which has become very it's a mature, sad voice by the end of the novel, because she has grown up and the sad events of the novel have taken place, which have colored her whole way of looking at things. So it begins from there, and that's where you get the barrenness and whatever, because she has been affected like that by what has taken place. And Banaras, before that, of course, is a very lively city, and it, as I said, it all started with Banaras for me, because this novel, as I see it, is more about time, you know, and you know, the origins of time, the city which has been around for so long, and what does time mean for different people, for different cities, and you know, how things take shape. And because it's Banaras, the time gets almost a mythological dimension.
Right.
And it basically explores time and memory. This whole novel is exploring time and the way we remember things, which is why the structure of the novel also becomes like a spiral.
Yeah.
It's a sort of a spiral structure, and time is a circular process.
Right.
Things happen only when they are remembered, so the present becomes the past and the past becomes the present. It's all going, you know, round and round, because the structure is cyclical. You
Right.
know. Time is a cyclical process.
Right. अबाबील की उड़ान कहानियों पर टिप्पणी करते हुए निर्मल वर्मा साहब ने एक बहुत रोचक बात कही थी। यदि फॉस्टर के कथन ओनली कनेक्ट में कला का मर्म छिपा है, तो सारा राय उसकी विलक्षण प्रतिभा हैं। वो अजनबी चीज़ों के बीच रिश्ता खोजकर एक सत्य उजागर कर सकती हैं। हिंदी और उर्दू के शब्द उनकी कहानियों में बिना कोई मिशनरी आग्रह लिए अपने आप चले आते हैं, और वो कहीं भी आरोपित नहीं जान पड़ते। You do not appear to be writing to champion any cause for either Hindi or Urdu or English. Would you comment on that?
No, but I think it's much more a natural process with me, because I think language is something that is moving and flowing all the time, and it as Kabir I think called it, bhasha behta neer. It's like a river that's flowing and it's gathering in whatever it, comes in. It's all being absorbed in the language,
right.
and it should not show. I'm against linguistic purity. I don't think it should just be
right.
cleaned out of other languages. Should be cleaned out of one language. So as far as I think, as I feel that it should be a kind of syncretic language.
Yeah.
And that is the process that's going on in this country also. We are a country, a very multilingual, multicultural sort of country, and there are all sorts of streams that are have come together in our whole knowledge about ourselves, our whole historical consciousness and our whole past.
Right.
It's all come together like that, and I don't think things should be taken out separately and Urdu word है कि हिंदी word है कि क्या है, उसको उस तरह से नहीं देखना चाहती हूँ मैं. एक पूरी में एक जैसे बहता हुआ एक नैरेटिव होना चाहिए जिसमें कि आप जहाँ पे आपको नेचुरल लगे वो चीज़ आप उसमें डाल सकें, वहाँ पे वो शब्द आप इस्तेमाल करें.
और लैंग्वेज पॉलिटिक्स को अगर हम साइड करें तो कोई सोशल या आइडियोलॉजिकल, जैसे प्रेमचंद की कहानियों में अक्सर होता था, देयर वाज अ सोशल कॉज अंडरलाइनिंग द नैरेटिव. सो इज देयर वन वर्ल्ड व्यू दैट यू हैव दैट यू सॉर्ट ऑफ सीप इनटू योर शॉर्ट स्टोरीज और नॉवेल्स दैट वी कैन फाइंड इन योर राइटिंग पर से?
नहीं, उस तरह का तो मेरे ख्याल से नहीं है, लेकिन आई हैव कंसर्न्स एट द बॉटम ऑफ माई राइटिंग. शायद इतनी उस तरह से मैं उनको नहीं पुश करती हूँ. जैसे प्रेमचंद से तो खैर मेरा मुकाबला क्या है, वो तो उनका दूसरा ही बिल्कुल वो है. मैं अपनी ज़मीन पे खड़ी हूँ, जिस तरह की चीज़ मैं अपने छोटे मोटे ढंग से कह पाती हूँ, कहने की कोशिश करती हूँ. तो बहुत सारे कंसर्न्स हैं जो मेरी राइटिंग के पीछे रहते हैं, उनको मैं अपने ढंग से कहती हूँ, लेकिन एक उसमें कोई आग्रह करने की वो नहीं रहती है, क्योंकि मैं लिखती हूँ वो एक अपने विचार एक तरह से साफ करने के लिए. इट्स अ डायलॉग विथ माई सेल्फ एंड इट इज़ आई मीन द रीडर इज इंसिडेंटल, यू सी, एंड आई एम ट्राइंग टू क्लैरिफाई थिंग्स टू माई सेल्फ एंड आई एम थिंकिंग एंड समथिंग वरीज मी, I worry about it and I keep at it till I can get something, worry it like a dog with a bone maybe.
So
like
coming to the translation bit, a translator's job is very demanding, not merely of linguistic skill but also of various aesthetic, ideological and identity related positions. So for instance, I read this introduction to your book Hindi that you have translated and edited. It says the book is an anthology of translated stories that hold an element of surprise for Western readers who expect an Indian narrative technique and an Indian fabric of life. So when you translate a book, how do you address the question of what work to translate, for whom and why at all?
Well, I think in that particular introduction that I was writing, I said it would hold an element of surprise for the Western reader because of the problem of exoticization. People like to think of India as being someplace exotic, whereas the stories that I have chosen all deal with a very modern consciousness. They are very, very particular in the sense that they are set on Indian soil. They are about India. But India itself has changed. There are many things that are going on here which would maybe people from the Western world would not expect. They would expect some other kind of narrative, the whole stereotype about India that goes around.
Right.
So it would be a surprise for that sort of reader if they were expecting any such narrative. Otherwise, they are not meant particularly for the Western reader or for the Indian reader. I am happy with whoever wants to read the translations.
Nirmal Verma has said something very nice about your work. He said, विवरणात्मक कहानी की लगभग मृत पाई शैली को सारा राय ने सीधे संवेदनशील ढंग से पुनर्जीवित किया है. Can we say that you have chosen to persist with the traditional style of storytelling?
मेरी कहानियों में एक देखने पर बहुत महत्व है, देखने का बहुत महत्व है. Things are seen in very, very closely and whole architecture of things may be set up. एक पूरी scene बना दी जाती है जिसमें कि एक जैसे लगता है कि ये इमारत खड़ी है चीज़ों की, और उसमें से एक बहुत बारीकी में देखी हुई है और उसमें कनेक्शंस मैं ढूंढती हूँ. जिस कहानी का उन्होंने इसमें किया जिक्र, ओनली कनेक्ट वाली जिसमें आपने कही थी, वो कहानी मुझे अबाबील की उड़ान है. उसमें वो कहानी है, वो मृत्यु को लेके है. एक बच्ची का भाई है, वो कहीं दूर जाके उसकी मृत्यु हो गई है, इसको बताया नहीं गया बच्ची को, और वो सोच रही है कि मेरा भाई मरा है कि नहीं मरा है, और उसके दिल में वो दहशत भरती जा रही है मौत को लेके. तो वो लेटी है और आसमान में देखती है, तो एक अबाबील, एक चिड़िया है जो बहुत ऊंचे उड़ रही है. तो अबाबील के एक चिड़िया स्वॉलो जो होती है, उसके भाई, इसी भाई जो मर गया है, उसने बताया था कि ये एक अबाबील एक अकेली चिड़िया है जो इतनी ऊंचे उड़ती है आसमान में कि शिकरा जो है, जो बाज होता है, फैल्कन, उसे पकड़ नहीं सकता, इतनी ऊंचाई पर उड़ती है. तो वो चिड़िया देखती है और कहती है क्या ये अबाबील है, मन में सोचती है अबाबील है, सोच रही है अगर ये अबाबील है इसका मतलब भाई नहीं मरा है क्योंकि वो चिड़िया अकेली है जो मुक्त है. तो अगर तो देयर इज अ स्ट्रेंज कनेक्शन between death and that flying bird.
Right.
So it's a sort of emblem of freedom for the girl. तो वो एक कनेक्शन है, उसको लेके उन्होंने ये लिखी थी. ओनली कनेक्ट का जो फॉस्टर का कथन है उन्होंने इस कहानी पर उसको जोड़ा था, इसलिए तो ये उसके पीछे का.
You raised a question in your introduction to the collection Hindi. You said Indian writers in English, often newly arrived on the scene, have been seen as representing the mammoth cauldron of many cultures that is India. Can we really treat them as such? Would it not be necessary first to understand the cultural and literary heritage that brought about the phenomena of the Indian writer in English? Can a whole new literature be created and sustained just by market forces? I address this question to you.
English writing has come out of some space, obviously, and English writing is fairly new. So there's this whole literary tradition, I think, of writing in the regional languages. That we have so many languages and there's thriving literature in many of them. So there's this whole seething cauldron. और English भी कहाँ से आई है? कहीं से तो आई है, colonial उससे तो भाषा आई है. लेकिन you're writing about an experience that is very typically of the soil. It is not set in England or not set in somewhere else. So that there's this whole thing behind that English. So you can feel the multilingualism, the multicultural thing pushing up behind the English writing. And because of the market forces, somehow the English writing gets to be known more about, and people see it that way.
Your translated and edited collection, which is your latest work, Premchand's Kazaki and Other Marvelous Tales, has Premchand's compelling story brought to us by his granddaughter. Do you think your belonging to the tradition allows you a deeper insight into Premchand's work? And how has your awareness of anecdotes, of family memories affected your translation of Premchand's work? If there is anything that you'd like to share with us.
They are the stories behind the stories, which I have also dealt with in the book itself. There's a section on the stories behind the stories, and there are things which are known, of course, to the Hindi and the Urdu reading public, but the English reading public may not be aware of some of them. Well, the title story, for instance, Kazaki.
Right.
Kazaki is actually a true story that Premchand, in his encounter in his childhood, he was, I think, about 13 or 14 years old, and his father was then posted in Jamnia, which is a small district. And then there used to be these dark runners, the male runners, or harkaras as they were called. And Kazaki was his father was a postmaster in the village, and Kazaki was the harkara. So, well, it stems from his personal experience. Kazaki was a great friend of Premchand's, and the story deals with his relationship with Kazaki.
And Sara, what is the next work that you're
Well, currently I'm engaged on writing a book of short stories. There's also a novel playing somewhere in the background.
Yeah.
But I've got further with the stories just now, so probably that will be the next thing that comes out.
Thanks a lot for talking to us.
Thank you very much for having me on the show.
All the very best for the short stories and the novel.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching.
The woman sitting next to me, I know her as my mother, but you know her as the Israeli writer Zeruya Shalev, and one of the most successful Israeli writers we have abroad, and certainly the most successful female writer Israeli. I know you as my mother. This is your identity for me. You have an identity as an Israeli writer, as a female writer. Would you please tell me how it is to be an Israeli writer, a woman Israeli writer writing in modern times?
Well, my sweet daughter, thank you for this question. Being an Israeli writer, it's quite complex because you have a lot of expectations around you. You are expected to write about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, about the ongoing war, about the establishing of the state, about Zionism or anti-Zionism. But I had to find my own way. I felt that my country can control my life, but I will not let it control my writing. And I write about intimate issues. I prefer to write about the borders of emotions and not the borders of nations. I prefer to deal with the war between sexes and not the war between nations. And I prefer to describe the inner drama in the family, in the human being itself, than to deal with the drama, with the ongoing drama around us.
Do you feel this is your way of resisting this ongoing situation which dehumanizes most of its participants?
Yes, I think it's a kind of resistance. I think especially in a state like Israel, we have to be very sensitive to nuances, and we have to develop the sensitivity for language and for emotions when we write and also when we read.
May I read a paragraph from the beginning of your latest book? Would you want to read one as well?
Yes, my dear. It's an honor for me if you read it.
This is from The Remains of Love by Zeruya Shalev. Has the room really grown in size, or is she the one who has shrunk? This is, after all, the smallest room in a minuscule apartment. But now, as she is confined to her bed from morning till evening, it seems his dimensions have expanded. It would take her hundreds of paces to reach the window, hours by the score, and who knows if she will live long enough. The remains of life, that is, the last remnant of the portion of time allotted to her, in some absurd fashion feels like eternity. Being in such a state of immobility, it seems it is stretching away into the infinite. The truth is, she is already withered and wizened, as light as a ghost, and the slightest gust of wind would be enough to blow her away from the bed, and it appears it is only the weight of the blanket that stops her from hovering in the void. And it is also true that any breath could sever the last thread of spool that connects her to life. But who will do the breathing? Who will even take the trouble to breathe in her direction? Yes, for many years to come, she will be lying here under her thick blanket, seeing her children growing older, her grandchildren turning into adults. Yes, with sour indifference, they will condemn her to eternal life, because it seems to her suddenly that even the act of dying requires some effort, some vitality on the part of the future deceased or of his environment. Personal attention is needed, a degree of ancient communication, like the preparations for a birthday party. Even dying requires a measure of love, while she is no longer loved enough, and perhaps not even loving enough, even for this. Namaskar.
Namaste.